There we go. Perfect. It's working. All right. We'll get going here.
Just a quick second before things go on. The Scout project is going.
All right. Thank you for whoever got the Bibles out. I appreciate that because I just thought, I'm like, I should have gotten the Bibles out. Matthew. We're talking Matthew. We did a lot of. Not Monday through Wednesday. I basically just slept.
You didn't lose your taste, though.
No. Not that I'm aware of. My wife might disagree. Yeah. So the current trajectory is we're going to finish up Matthew today, and then next week we'll start John, and then we'll wrap John up on the 24th of July, because then we've got the semi-annual meeting on the 31st. Skip August. So August, I'm going to be gone for at least one, possibly 2 Sundays, making my annual, well, I wouldn't call it annual, my frequent trip back to Michigan. I'm driving back with the dogs, staying with my dad, seeing my grandparents, and then coming back. So we won't have adult ed through August. We will pick up again on September 11th. So the first Sunday after Labor Day, we'll start up again. I definitely want to do another Bible topic. I'm enjoying being back in that again. I have a couple of other topics that I'm kind of floating around too, that people have tossed ideas at me. Stephanie would like to do another session at some point. She wants to do some classes, potentially in here, potentially in another venue as well too, on humanizing homelessness. So kind of a bridge onto the stuff that she talked about with you guys last time. So I don't have the schedule planned out yet, but you'll get a picture of it. But today's the last day of Matthew. Next week, the next 3 Sundays, we'll do the Gospel of John, and then we're done with this session. If you have any specific Bible, books of the Bible, topics in the Bible, anything like that that you want to discuss this fall, shoot them to me. I'm always on the search for ideas. A couple of ideas that I had already were, and I think I maybe mentioned this 3 weeks ago, is picking apart a couple of the epistles again, because I don't remember which ones we did. I think we did Corinthians. We did Philippians for sure. I don't know if we ever did Galatians. I think we did Galatians. But I don't, and we did Romans. I hit most of those. It might be helpful to go back and look at a couple of those again. I'm tempted to look at Galatians again, just because I'm kind of looking at it with new eyes recently and really enjoying the. Since you can't remember anyways, it doesn't matter. Perfect. So that's the current agenda. So let's do a brief. There you perfect. I like that. I like that outlook. Let's do a quick recap. Let's talk about Matthew real quick. So highlights or hot things for Matthew. So reminder, Matthew primary profession was a tax collector. He was a tax collector, most likely born in or around Nazareth. He was a contemporary of Jesus, probably would have been a similar age. Dies sometime late 1st century, somewhere near, I don't remember. I had it written down here. Near Hierapolis, apparently. But again, like we've talked about, keep in mind a lot of these details about the lives of the apostles can't be. We don't have any second source for criticism on a lot of them. They're mostly. I'm looking for a word and I can't find it. Whatever, doesn't matter. So, tax collector. The 2 weeks before we took 2 weeks off, we talked a lot about the significance of that. Matthew's call story is in the gospel. He talks about himself in there, refers to himself as a tax collector. So obviously, his identity for him was a really important thing in terms of what it meant for him to be a disciple of Jesus. The fact that he, a tax collector, was called to follow Jesus was really important. He wants to make sure that the reader understands that. And then, of course, the theme of the undesirables, the tax collectors, tax collectors, prostitutes, the sinners, capital S, is a theme that runs throughout Matthew. He wants to call attention to the fact that those are the people that Jesus intentionally spends his time with. We talked as well about how the category, for example, of prostitute is a lot of times misapplied for a lot of our characters in both the New and the Old Testament. We talked about, for example, Rahab was probably just a single wealthy merchant, right? But because there is no room for that, identity, no room for a wealthy woman who's not married in that society, she is kind of generally categorized as prostitute. And that proves true for a lot of women in both the Old and the New Testament. Why is this important? Well, 2 weeks ago, we read the genealogy of Jesus, right? Which is a passage that is unique to the Gospel of Matthew. It's how Matthew starts out his Gospel. And who do we find in that genealogy but women like Rahab, right? So, again, Matthew is saying something through the way that he presents the gospel narrative about the importance of the fact that the people who are culture or our society or even our religious institutions, people who might be, according to those understandings, considered outside of the sphere of what is considered holy, right? Or even acceptable or permissible. That those are the people that Jesus intentionally invites and spends time with. But those are also the people that make up Jesus's own identity, his own genealogy. If we look, through that list of people, we not only have Rahab, we have Bathsheba, who is not named. She's listed as the wife of Uriah. We've got Ruth, right? Ruth is such a fantastic narrative. But those are the things that we ought to pay attention to in Matthew. Okay. Other pieces about Matthew, and today we're going to look at a couple of passages after I finish blabbing. Excuse me. We're going to look very briefly. We're not going to spend a lot of time. We're going to look at the Matthew's version of the Beatitudes because we looked at Luke's version. I want to go back and gaze upon that with fresh eyes again. We're also going to look at a couple of the parables that are unique to Matthew. Because again, Luke can be categorized as the quote-unquote healing gospel in a lot of ways. That's what we read. That's what we heard about today in the sermon text. Matthew, coincidentally, has a lot of parables that have to do with money, believe it or not, which isn't that shocking. And a lot would be maybe a little bit of notice. He has parables about money. Matthew also has, he is the one that introduces the wheat and the weeds concept. One of the things that has always been hard for me, or I shouldn't say always has been, one of the things that was hard for me in engaging Matthew when I was in seminary is Matthew always seemed mean. Matthew has some of the more judgmental language in it. Anybody else get that impression? So the stories that we have in Matthew are sheep go to heaven, goats go to hell. All right? You all familiar with that one, the sheep and the goats, the weeds and the wheat. Matthew has Jesus giving some of his harshest criticisms, okay, which is something that can be hard for us to hear because if we're hearing it from the perspective of we have this image of Jesus as loving and forgiving, and we hear Matthew having Jesus say, you need all the weeds will be gathered and burned into the fires of Gehenna and scattered to the wind. That's tough, right? That's tough for us to hear. So we'll look at that, okay? But first, let's turn to Matthew 5. Which is, I don't want the NIV, I want the NRSV. Do you have it? Great. Wait.
NRSV is changed. It's like new, revised, updated.
Yes. I'll just grab one of these. There are way more drop downs than I anticipated. We've got New Revised Standard Version Anglicized, New Revised Standard Version Anglicized Catholic Edition, New Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition, New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. Jeez Louise. It's the NRSV UE. Man, biblical scholars love their acronyms as almost as much as engineers do. Okay, so Matthew 5. Look, I flipped right to it. Perfect. The Beatitudes. Does anyone remember some of the things that we talked about when we looked at Luke's version of this?
More to the point.
Luke, yes. Yeah, Luke is more physical. Luke is more imminent. Luke also includes the woes. We talked a little bit about, some things that characterize Matthew's version. The language is more spiritual. So one of the things I would encourage you to think about as we read through this are why. I use the singular and I move to a plural. Apologies. Why, perhaps, does Matthew move the language of the Beatitudes more in a direction of applying to our spiritual well-being or our spiritual status, as opposed to, or in contrast, not as opposed, in contrast with Luke, who is really concerned seemingly about the physical. Blessed are the poor in Luke versus blessed are the poor in spirit in Matthew. Okay, so I'm going to read Matthew 5, 1 through 11. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he began to speak and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Anything, what are the things that you're hearing in Matthew's version of this? Things that mayhap you hear differently than when we read this in Luke, or things that just jumped out at you this time? Jill.
The poor in spirit line
Yeah.
seems completely different than like all the rest.
Yeah. How so?
Well, so it talks about, the meek or the peaceful or the
Yeah.
These are things that Jesus is all about. Like,
Yeah.
do these things.
Yeah.
But then he's got a couple others in there that aren't on the Jesus list. And poor in spirit is one of them.
Yeah.
So that's weird.
So you're inviting a really interesting conversation, which is one that you have to have in reading Matthew's account of the Beatitudes, is what does poor in spirit mean? What conceptually does it mean to be poor in spirit? Now, when I was growing up, which wasn't all that long ago, one of the things that I heard, and I don't know that people were saying this explicitly, one of the things that I heard was that poor in spirit were people who struggled with faith. Is that a concept that others had? Yeah, that was kind of the orthodox version that was presented to me. However, and I'm not denying that, because I think that's a good thing to hear as well too. However, one of the things that I struggle with is that if you really try and conceptualize poor in spirit, right, it seems to me to literally mean lacking animus, right? So spirit in this case is the word pneuma, right, from which we get pneumatic. It's breath, it's wind. It's also the Greek word that the gospel writers use to describe the Holy Spirit. Poor is lacking. It's having an insufficiency of, and whatever.
It's sort of like a child learning.
Sure. In what way do you hear that, Carolyn?
Because the poor, they need help. They need guidance. They need somebody to help them.
Sure, absolutely. Kind of similar to what I was talking about in the sermon. There's some training to be done yet.
I liked Matthew better because it explained more to me that wasn't so literal. When you read Luke and it says, "Blessed are the poor," as a child growing up, kept thinking, "Oh my gosh, you need to be poor."
Yeah.
See, taking it in the literal sense.
Yes.
And then when you read the rest, you keep thinking of it in the terms of being literal rather than spiritual.
And you have put your finger on something which is a struggle in reading the Beatitudes, no matter what, which is we tend to hear them as a challenge to us, as opposed to a word of blessing, right? So especially in Luke, blessed are the poor. The first thought that goes through my mind as well too is, what is the income bracket that defines poor? And how can I straddle that line on the upper end of that bracket? So how do I remain in that blessed scenario, but maximize my earning potential? Is that what way anybody else's brain works, right? Because then Luke doesn't leave it up to imagination. Woe to you who are rich. You have received your reward. Well, crud, man. Linda.
Well, I guess it's kind of a continuation into everything's been said, but when I think of poor in spirit, my immediate thought is sadness.
That's that is a really important thing to hear. In fact, I think the last time that I preached on Matthew, that was the direction that I went with it as well too, is talking about how important it is to hear those words. What does it mean to you to hear, however we're understanding poor in spirit, what does it mean for Jesus to say, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven? What does it mean to possess, to receive the kingdom of heaven? And what do you hear?
I wondered when I've thought a lot of that. Do I have to give everything away to be poor? But to me, that's spiritually poor.
That's the tough part, isn't it? Yeah. Right? Am I consigning myself to eternal suffering because my my tax forms were on the
Does that mean you have to buy your way into heaven?
and you're highlighting one of the challenges. Now, and again, I hesitate to immediately go to my Lutheran orthodoxy hammer. But this Luther would argue is one of the things this is one of the reasons why it's so important for us to proclaim the gospel, is because as human beings, our default place to go to is, number one, what do I need to do to earn whatever, right? Earn salvation, earn the love of God. But then number two is immediately to go to, whatever I do, I don't deserve it, right? Which is why, and again, I apologize for using the Lutheran theology hammer in this case, but this is why Luther would say it's so important to hear over and over and over and over again. There is nothing that you can do to earn salvation as a free gift. We are absolutely undeserving of it, and yet God gives it to us anyways, right? But, however, I think it's still important that we acknowledge that that's where our brain goes. That's where our heart goes, is to hearing, I'm not included in this. Paul, you're chewing on something.
Well, I am chewing because to me it's a paradoxical statement.
Mm-hmm.
In that, when I am empty enough to receive, because I'm not too proud to receive, I am blessed. If I am in the depression, such that I'm self-loathing, so that I cannot hear the gospel,
Yeah.
I'm not very blessed. So that my default in that is to go, well, no matter what, the losers are blessed here, all through this. We got to stay with that and realize that we're all going to lose because our hearts are going to stop beating, at some point. And those kind of things. I default to those, but it's richer for me to stay in that place of humility that is not self-centered. Humility that really understands our commonality with all creatures and all other people, and then we're in a place of learning. I love what you did with learning and discipleship this morning. And when I'm not in a place of learning, I am not very blessed. I take on the mantle of expertise, and I'm in trouble.
Yeah, absolutely.
I guess that's the overall import to me, because then it doesn't become about, oh, okay, Matthew's got me in this part of the ledger, in the tax ledger, right? It's not that anymore. It's, my gosh, we all have these places where we need to be tuned into ourselves and God and others better. And that is the place of blessing.
I love that insight as well too, is that, because this is a question I often ask, is, I often wonder is, the person who is writing these words, how are they hearing them as well too? Because again, Matthew, a person who simultaneously has spent his life with ledgers, lists, accounting, making sure pennies don't drop off but also simultaneously has been probably uniquely reviled by his community because of his collaboration with the Roman Empire. Here's somebody who might even say themselves that they're hearing this phrase "poor in spirit" in several different ways as well too. And this is, and by the way, I don't suppose this needs to be said, but I think it's important to say is that, by the way, this is why we read the Bible, right? This is what the work of being disciples looks like as well. I am always terrified when I encounter somebody who is supremely confident that this is exactly what this passage means, right? Who can tell me with absolute certainty the orthodox interpretation of what spiritually deficient means, right? That's scary as heck, man. And I will say, I will also add on, I have been that person. I am that person many times because I'm a person who loves the intellectual rigor of scriptural engagement. I love being right as well, too. And this is one of the challenges with this. I think this is also one of the powerful things of Matthew opening with, blessed are the poor in spirit. Because however you conceptualize this, right, however you kind of like bend that metaphor, one of the things that seems to be true here is that Matthew is describing people who would almost universally be described as not being right. And notice something. Jill, you had your finger on it, and you said, one of these things isn't like the others. Notice the tense of the verbiage that's used, okay? There are only 2 items in this entire list of things which are not in the future tense, but are in the passive present. One is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then finally, it's, blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and glad, for your reward is great in heaven. All of the other blessings are describing in some way a future, right? So blessed are the meek. They will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They will be filled. It seems to be describing some kind of corrective. The fascinating thing about these 2 pieces is that it's not a description of sometime in the future. It's a description of this now, which Paul identified is an extremely frustrating oxymoron. Right? Again, if you're poor in spirit, and Paul, you said it well, insofar as that you are empty enough to actually receive the kingdom of heaven, you're also probably spiritually and emotionally in a place where you don't feel like you deserve it. Right? You're depleted. Yeah, great word. Okay. And yet, this is exactly what Jesus says. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for they possess the kingdom of heaven. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. How do you feel about oxymorons? This is frankly, this is one of the most important things, right? In reading scripture is embracing and celebrating the fact that so many of our most important passages are self-contradictory. They do not present to us a clear path of saying, well, these are the people that Matthew was speaking about specifically. This is exactly what it means to possess the. In other words, there is no goal, there is no destination that we arrive at in trying to understand this. What you end up doing is you end up doing this, which is the learning process, right? Okay, for the teachers in the room, right? Any insight into the process of learning?
Maybe it's to help. For me, it was to make me feel better about myself.
Absolutely.
And that we have a time of where we're all spiritless, sort of.
Absolutely.
And we have questioning. So that's maybe when we're the most open
Absolutely.
to be accepting of the Spirit of the Lord, which is if we're full of ourselves and we think we have it all together, then we've shut ourselves down to thinking there's anything different.
I think there are 2 ways in which we hear this. There's more than 2, but there's 2 important ones. One way is to hear it and say, which we already kind of talked about, is to say, I'm poor in spirit, and I can't conceptualize this idea of possessing the kingdom of heaven because I really don't feel that way right now. So in other words, you're the person that feels like they're on the receiving end of this language. The other way that we hear it is to say, who are they, right? Who are those people that this is describing? And right there, you kind of create two categories. Again, there are more ways. I hesitate to say it. These are the only two ways. There are more ways to hear this, but this kind of describes the efficacy of this language, which is that if you need to hear good news in this, right? If you need to hear that in the midst of your depression, you need to hear that there's hope, right? These words speak to you. You might not be able to conceptualize it in that moment, but Jesus is speaking to you, right? Okay? And it's a long path from being empty in spirit to conceptualizing what it means to be possessing the kingdom of heaven. There's an infinite distance between those two things, right? That's a long, long way to get from A to B there. But it does not diminish the need to hear it. If you hear this, if you read this, and your brain immediately goes to, well, but who are those people who are poor in spirit? You need to hear this, right? In other words, it becomes a challenge to you as well, too. And I think that, Jesus, well, I don't know what Jesus intends, but I think that we need to hear all of these. In other words, I think that in this crowd of people that were listening to this, you had people who were sitting there going, oh, I know who he's talking about. And keep in mind, one thing I haven't brought in yet, but it is, because I didn't want to go to, well, this is the answer. But one of the things that, I think we talked about it 2 weeks ago, but one of the things to think about with Matthew is again, who's his audience? Traditionally, we have identified that Matthew seems to be speaking to people who have a Jewish identity and are somewhere in that Christian spectrum, right? Maybe are considering it, maybe are already in that process, or maybe are nowhere near it. Matthew seems to be speaking to people who identify as Jewish, right? Whatever that means in this day and age, in this context, okay? I mention this because I also think it's important for us to think about and wonder about how would they hear these words as well too. How would they hear, blessed are the poor in spirit? And I say this because being poor in spirit is in no way, shape, or form a good thing in historical Hebrew thought. In fact, it is explicitly a bad thing, okay? In fact, in Proverbs, right, you have this reinforcement of this idea of blessings and woes, and those who are blessed are favored by God, and those whom God despises are cursed, okay? And we tend to play this up a little bit too much, okay? It's not like everybody walked down the street thinking this way, but I mentioned it last week. This thought, this way of viewing the world is absolutely present, though, in Jesus' day and age, even amongst the disciples, right? Again, we've got the story of the man who's born blind at birth, and what's the question they ask Jesus? Who sinned, he or his parents? In other words, this man arguably could be deficient in spirit, right? And the question they have is, well, what did he do to deserve that? The opening salvo of Matthew's version of the Beatitudes is a stinger if you're operating under that mindset, right? It is in one line an intentional destruction of the idea that we can determine who God loves and who God hates based on their physical or earthly well-being, right? It is a destruction of prosperity gospel.
And that's why you can't do the sheep and goats thing.
Yep.
With people, you have to do it with yourself.
Yep.
When I'm a goat, man, I stink. I really stink.
Yep.
And I do. And sometimes I'm a sheep.
Yep.
and then same with the grain and the wheat. Some days you're the wheat that needs to be pulled out of the ground. and into fairly fruitful.
Which is why I also love, the story of the rich man and Lazarus, which is an intentional follow-up to that understanding. It's because, so imagine being one of the 12 disciples or one of the 70 that are following Jesus around. Where do you think the temptation lies for them? I think the temptation lies in thinking they're in the in crowd with Jesus. And over again, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is really intentional to destroy any firm foundation that people think they have with regards to being in the in crowd or being in the out crowd, right? I think that is what the Gospel of Matthew does the best, whether it's the sheep or the goats, whether it's the wheat or the weeds. You can't read those stories and not feel condemned. If you do, or if you don't, something's wrong with you. I would argue.
I think also alludes to what Richard Niebuhr always said, which is we're much worse in the group than we are individually. Our group keeps reinforcing that we are the elect, that
Yep.
we are the righteous. And man, that really makes it tough to be poor in spirit.
Oh.
Or to feel like you're part of that group.
But that's such an important thing, though, because using language of poor, it's a contrast word, right?
Yeah.
Poor is a relative word. Poor relative to what, right? It does not describe a specific quantity. Like, blessed are those who have less than 10 spirit. However you quantify it. Poor is a contrast to wealthy or to rich or to not poor, right? Because again, nobody identifies themselves as wealthy. Well, some people do, but and celebrate that. But most folks want to try and justify their existence in the middle class somehow, right? Just believe me for a second. Okay. But poor it's a contrast word. It's a relative word, meaning that if you try to identify whether you exist in that category, it's always relative to another person. And this is the danger, is because this is how groupthink works. This is how our brains work, is we are wired to look and say which one of these things isn't like the others. It's a safety mechanism, right? It's how we protect ourselves, it's how we protect our communities, right? How many of you have had an experience where you're at a playground with your kids and you said, that person doesn't belong here? How many have you had that experience? Or you just see a person walking down the street and your hackles go up and you can't figure out why. This is what our brains do. Unfortunately, what that means, though, is that our brains also drive us to exclude people from our groups. It's just nature, because that's the way that we protect ourselves. However, again, this is the struggle, is that it seems to me that Jesus, over and over and over again, says, that's not how the kingdom of heaven works, though. Right? Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Right? Here's the oxymoron. Because when you hear theirs is the kingdom of heaven, your brain also goes to, but then it's not mine. Right? If I don't fall in that category of poor in spirit, then I don't possess it. Why did they get it? So anyways, I don't want to belabor this, but yeah, I have fun. I love the intellectual exercise of this. So I apologize if this is a tangent that I'm happy to race forward at full speed on. Okay, let's look at the parable of the weeds and the wheat, because it's wonderful. So we're going to look at the weeds and the wheat, and then eventually we'll look at sheep and the goats, if we have time. So weeds and wheat, we're going to turn to Matthew 13. Also, we tend to know it as the parable of the sower, but I often wonder, this isn't unique to Matthew, but I often wonder also at the specificity that Matthew uses in his description of sowing seeds. I've often wondered if perhaps Matthew, before he was a tax collector, was raised as a farmer. That being said, though, it's also a pretty safe bet that almost everybody in the Galilean region has some knowledge of farming. It's just inevitable. That's the farming region, right? Anyways, okay. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat beside the sea. Such great crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat there while the whole crowd stood on the beach. I love the imagery here. And he told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen, a sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up." My wife would hate this passage, by the way, trying to figure out what verb of sowing, who is this person? Are they knitting fabric? Anyway, sorry. Homonyms and French people are just not, yeah. And as he sowed, some seeds fell on the path, and the birds came and ate them up. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil, and they sprang up quickly since they had no depth of soil. But when the sun rose, they were scorched, and since they had no root, they withered away. Other seeds fell amongst thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Other seeds fell on good soil and brought forth grain, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Let anyone with ears listen. What if I don't have ears? Do I have to listen?
You're not able.
I'm not able to. Yeah, what does this say about people who have lost their hearing? They're not subject to this scrutiny? Does that mean I have to become deaf? Is that what Jesus? But that contradicts what I just said this morning. So, never mind. Okay. Sorry, I was going to go off on this whole riff about how I should probably be more cognizant that there are people who are hard of hearing, and listening need to be more metaphorical. But anyways, okay. Okay, same questions. What are you hearing? Anything that stands out to you in this reading of it? Or imagining, wondering, guessing at the context of Matthew, anything that you're seeing differently? What's the major question that you are asking at the end of this?
How can I get lucky and be one of those two?
How do I get sown in the good soil?
Maybe it's just, what I happen to be reading or listening to from you lately, but now I'm starting to wonder, with his audience, are the scorched folk the Gentiles?
Mm.
I mean, it's like, yeah, they won't get it. They're not going to get burned up. You have this deep history of old soil.
That's a good question.
I'm actually not sure of your question. Can you refine the question?
Yes.
So okay, we're trying to figure out who Matthew's talking to, right?
Yeah.
And it gets to the section where, the soil isn't very deep,
Right.
so it gets scorched. So they're like all in, but they don't have any of the history that his audience has. Those are the people that come a bit later. So I'm wondering if he's talking about Gentiles in that section. Maybe he's not.
And I would say, regardless, I guarantee that there are people that are hearing it that way. Yeah. Not knowing, but assuming the audience here, right? Assuming that that Matthew is writing to people Jewish in identity who are questioning Christianity. I guarantee that somebody is going, well, that's exact. They don't have the depth of theological. Well, I wouldn't use that language, but they don't have the depth of theological understanding to receive. How many of you, at first blush reading, assume that the seeds are describing people?
How many of you what?
And understanding the metaphor, how many of you hear that the seeds are people that are being sown? Okay, how many hear that people are the soil that are receiving the seeds? There's no wrong answer here. I'm just really curious because it seems like we've maybe got a 50-50 split on that one.
I think he's talking about life in general.
Okay.
Because as we go in life, there are gonna be people we talk to, people we know that won't accept it all.
Yeah.
Others that maybe some, and then those who do believe, and the ones that come to church and
Sure.
pray
Sure.
with
Sure.
us and worship with us. But I think he's talking about life in general, the general population, the people that we meet in life.
Sure. Have you ever had an experience of metaphorically sowing seeds, and this might not even be religiously related, but sowing seeds and not having them take root? Yeah. Yeah, right? Literally, in my case as well, too.
Even some with our children.
Even some with your children. But literally, you know, my raised bed did okay, but my I planted a melon plant, which I had great hopes for, and it got scorched right off the bat, and I wondered what I did wrong.
And that in itself is part of the question, is whose fault is it? Is it the sower? Is it the wind that took the seed in the wrong direction? Is it the birds that came and ate it before it had a chance? Who's to blame?
And I would challenge just a little bit. Does there need to be blame?
Well, if again, you're the agronomist saying, I gotta get the acidity of the soil right, you know, all that.
Yeah.
Then, you know, you're doing a different analytical thing that isn't just a moral blame. And I think that's our attempt whenever the blame question comes up, is the intent is to control
Yeah.
the situation in some way. If I can just riff a little bit real quickly, my family, my nephew got shot last week. Last Saturday night in Minneapolis, he was 3 blocks away from a gang warfare that was going on, and a bullet flew almost 4 blocks into his brain. And you know, the family is just struggling with this. It makes 0 sense at all. It makes 0 sense. There's no blame to be had. It's just you're participating in the suffering of the world. You know, but there is no justifying. There is no reasoning that's powerful. It's just sad, tragic. It changes the family's life forever, as far as we can tell. Maybe he may recover. But you know, it's like there's so many categories that don't work, like blame. They just don't help at all because they're not applicable. So you almost wish for it because you would feel more in control. And this is a case where all you can be is the Holy Spirit.
Mm.
And pray and hope. And that is so much blood, right? Because the blaming is always, oh, I want to do something about this. And what you can do is not what you think you were able to do or set up in your mind you could do. It's a very vulnerable thing. That's why situation. So it's you know, I've always thought of this parable as saying, okay, well, how much of my time do I spend allowing myself to be better soil, crappy soil? Do I allow myself to be amended and worked with, or am I stuck in my resistant ways to what blessing there is? So that's what I do with this. I'm just getting personal.
I often wonder, like, I wonder how modern day farmers hear this, because again, I don't claim to have any great insight, but just reading through it now, my initial reaction was there isn't no bad soil. There's only poorly prepared soil, right? Like I was looking at this and I was going, well, did you use potting soil in your raised bed? Did you have the correct mix of aggregate so that it drained well? My wife has an ongoing battle with pots for plants. She can't find ones that she likes because if she finds ones that look good, they don't have a good drainage, which is frustrating. And I see a lot of you nodding your heads, right? And so she's experimenting with putting more aggregate in the bottom in the hopes that it'll drain, anyway. But the temptation, I think, always, and this is what we just got done talking about, the temptation is to look at this and say, well, either, this is about, groups of people, right? Maybe they're the seeds, maybe they're the soil. This is about individuals. I think, especially with Matthew's gospel, the thing that we need to try to do is always see it as the parable as a mirror, right? And not necessarily a spotlight. However, the reason I picked this parable in particular is because of the follow-up to it, which we haven't read yet. And the reason this follow-up is so important is because it shows me that even the disciples are going through exactly the same thing. If you, when we were reading this, were hoping that I was going to give you some great insight as to what this parable actually means, I'm sorry to disappoint. In fact, I am so glad that we sat here and kind of beat our heads against it for a little bit, because apparently that's exactly what Jesus intends. So if you look at the following passage, it has the subtitle, "The Purpose of the Parables." Then the disciples came and asked him, why do you speak to them in parables? He answered, you got to hear the sarcasm here, folks. I'm just telling you, heads up. To you, it has been given to know the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them, it has not been given. For to those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. The reason I speak to them in parables is that, parenthetically, seeing they do not perceive, and hearing they do not listen, nor do they understand. With them, indeed, is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah that says, you will indeed listen, but never understand, and you will indeed look, but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing, and they have shut their eyes so that they might not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and understand with their heart, and turn, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. Truly, I tell you, many prophets and righteous people longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and hear what you hear, but did not hear it. So here's the thing, and again, I've struggled with Matthew greatly over the course of my life. Here's the thing that I would point us towards here, is you've got, put yourself in this context, you've got the disciples asking Jesus, why do you speak so funny to these people? Right? Why do you tell these riddles? What seems like what Jesus says to the disciples is that I am intentionally confusing them. Does anybody else get that reading out of it? It's what I seem to be hearing, okay? And he quotes this passage from Isaiah, which, by the way, is a passage describing the state of Israel before the exile, seemingly intimating that Israel has lost its ability to hear and or see God present amongst them. Is Jesus just talking smack about the crowd? Is that what's going on? Is he saying to his disciples, I like messing with them? What's going on here? And again, we can't confidently say that we know what's going on here, but what might be going on here? Do you think that the disciples, the 12, have it all figured out? Do you think that they are privy to the secrets of the kingdom of heaven like Jesus just described?
They didn't have it figured out after he was crucified.
Yeah. Yes. Fast forward to the end, right? Do you think that they have the secrets of the kingdom of heaven?
Yes.
Yes. they absolutely do. They're 100% sure that they're in the in crowd.
Right, I can totally believe that he's talking smack to his disciples.
Yes.
Yes.
That one's pretty straightforward.
Yes.
too.
Yes.
But it's still weird when he's talking about with the crowd.
Yes. He's absolutely talking smack to his disciples. If you were to parse this a different way, you could argue that what Jesus is saying is, well, I speak to them in parables because they're capable of higher levels of thought and essentially debating what the meaning of the parable. You guys are such concrete thinkers that I basically just have to tell you explicitly. Right? This is another way to think about this. The reason I bring this up, and then it goes on, because then we get the parable of the sower explained, which is, by the way, case in point. Because the disciples ask him, why do you speak so funny to these people? And Jesus says the stuff we just talked about. And then they explicitly ask, essentially, but what did that one just mean? And Jesus is like, oh my goodness. Why didn't somebody say something when I picked these guys? Good Lord. You know what we need in this group is a couple of women. We need a couple of people that are capable of imagination and complex thought and aren't such concrete thinkers. Fishermen, am I right? So, going back to the actual parable, I love this. Because we just went through it. We sat here and we went, what's going on? Right? Am I good soil? Am I good seed? What are the consequences of me being bad soil? What are the times in my life, what are the experiences that I've had where I've tried to sow seeds and I was very unsuccessful? Why was I unsuccessful? Did I not prep the soil well enough? What can I do differently next time? We went through, I think, exactly what Jesus is talking about, right? Which is, in many ways, we struggled to hear. We struggled to see clearly. We struggled to understand in our hearts. That's learning. That's learning. And what that describes is having the ability to learn. Do you know what's the most dangerous mindset in this? It isn't listening to this parable and struggling with it. It's wanting to have it explained to you exactly. That's the most danger in this parable. It's being one of the 12 sitting there going, but just tell us to us straight, Jesus. Who are the weeds? Are they the Gentiles? Are you talking about the Gentiles? You're talking about the Gentiles, aren't you? Yeah.
I'm thinking who the birds.
Who are the birds? Right? Yeah.
They're gonna come and get me.
Yeah. Alfred Hitchcock, thank you very much for that trauma. Yes. Yeah, right? So, okay, we have arrived at the end of our time. Linda, go, sorry.
Well, this is just something that, because I don't think any of us, or even them back then, decided that they had the answer.
Yeah.
But the way Jesus talks about in parables makes it relative today to talk about it just as much as it was relative back then.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and just as an aside, that for me is the power of parable as well too. Is that granted, if you have no understanding of agriculture whatsoever, this isn't going to make a whole lot of sense to you, right? I think you'll still be able to grasp the general idea. I think it might have deeper meaning. Well, I shouldn't say that. It might have different meaning, approaching it from an agrarian perspective.
And the time period from what
Absolutely.
was going on then compared to what we're going through.
And this is why we do this work, right? This is why we try to understand the context into which this is written, the context of who he's writing to. This is the purpose of these weeks that we're doing here. And coming back around to that, as closing for today, if we're imagining that perhaps the community that Jesus is writing to are people who are coming from Judaism and are I describe it as a spectrum, but are struggling actively to understand and potentially embrace this idea of Jesus, okay? what's that look like for them? Well, we get a pretty good picture of it. In fact, it was in the epistle reading for today of Paul talking about those who want others to be circumcised so that they may boast in their flesh, right? In other words, those who want others to conform to how they think the world should be, and then they can celebrate that, which unfortunately describes a lot of Christianity now, is that we operate on this idea that the purpose of being a learner of Jesus is actually not to learn, it's to teach. It's to teach other people to be like us. What this parable explicitly does is it destroys that. It puts us in that mindset of sitting there going, I don't understand as much as I think that I do. Because if I read this one way, I'm feeling pretty condemned by it. I'm tempted to read it in a way that justifies myself, but I'm feeling condemned by it. If you're reading the parable of the sheep and the goats, spawned one of my favorite songs ever by a band named Cake. Sheep go to heaven, goats go to hell. It's literally a song. It's a wonderful song. You do the same thing. You're like, I feel conflicted by it, but I want to go the direction of using it as a weapon against others. When Jesus is asked why he uses these parables, essentially what he says to his disciples is, I use them to undermine the confidence that people have in their own self-righteousness. Okay. Now, this is what being a disciple is about. It seems stupid, right? This idea that being a disciple means walking constantly on shaky ground. I'm not sure that's necessarily it. But what happens when you realize that your foundation of your own righteousness is shaky? Well, you realize you need a different foundation, right? And I'm going to get this. I've started on a topic that would take me another hour to go on. I got to stop my tangent. But let's leave it with this. The purpose of parables is it's not to confuse, it's to challenge. It's to make you think, it's to make you work, and I would argue that's one of the best ways that you can learn. So, okay, last thing, 1 minute. So I mentioned several weeks ago, Matt, you were there, about the keynote speaker that was at Synod Assembly, who talked about using sutras as a way of learning, and that all that means is putting a question before people. For example, how do you pick up a snake? And our natural inclination is to mansplain exactly how you pick up a snake. You grab it behind the head so it can't bite you. And she says the question you should actually be asking is, why would you want to pick up a snake? Which I think is such a beautiful, concise way of even beginning to understand or beginning to think about how parables function in our reading of them. All right, John next week. No need to read anything unless you want to start reading through the Gospel of John. Next week we're going to do context, person of John, maybe look at a passage, and then we'll pick up actual Bible passages the following weeks. Okay, thank you, folks. Enjoy this beautiful weather. Have a happy 4th. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Don't get sick like I did. I don't know. I will check it. Okay, thanks for that.
I love the last line. That's what I used to say to lawyers. You'd say, we need a continuance of this. Why would you want that? Get out of here.
I didn't want to do that.